In the last program, we discovered how the mammals took over from the dinosaurs, producing the largest and most magnificent creatures on Earth. But then, at the end of the last ice age, it all went horribly wrong. Most of the huge mammals disappeared. This coincided with the rise of man, and he's often been blamed. But how could one species become that powerful? We humans like to think of ourselves as unique, a cut above the rest of the animal kingdom. But since the 19th century, we have known our place in nature. We are just another mammal, connected by our family tree to a beastly past. However, the story of how we became so unusual is one of the most extraordinary in evolution. It's easy to understand why we think we're so different. Our sophisticated use of technology seems to set us apart from other animals. Our extraordinary tool-making skills allows us to recreate anything from stone tools to artificial animals.
One more of those, please. Head up. Okay, and then down, a bit of chill.
Walking with Beasts is the story of the rise of mammals, and our history and the history of our ancestors is an integral part of that. Many of the things we think make us so special come from a group of animals that lie at the roots of our family tree. They are the primates. Nowadays, they come in all shapes and sizes, with a range of beards and hairstyles. This colorful group of animals are highly sociable and intelligent. So much of what we are comes from this group of creatures. So to really understand how humans became such a success story, we have to go way back. Back to a time just after the dinosaurs had died out, when primates first appeared in the branches. Some of those early primates looked remarkably similar to lemurs that still exist today. They still have the characteristics that first set early primates apart from other tree-dwelling mammals.
Well, this animal here is a black and white ruffed lemur, and she's a kind of primate from the island of Madagascar. This animal here is a coati, and he's a member of the raccoon family from Central and South America. Now, these are very, very different animals. The lemur, for example, if you look at her eyes, she's got two eyes that face forwards, and she's a tree-climbing animal, and that helps her to judge distance. Now, the coati is also a tree-climbing animal, but his eyes are more to the side of his head rather than on the front.
We know this is an ancient feature of primates because it has turned up in the earliest fossils.
This is the most exciting fossil primate there is, for two reasons. It's the oldest fossil primate that we have, where we have a skeleton. And secondly, it shows us all the key features because it's almost complete. And you can see from many features that it definitely is a primate.
All these features were adaptations to a life in the trees.
What primates have done is to rotate their eyes forwards, and bringing the eyes forward is incredibly important for three-dimensional vision. In order to see an object in 3 dimensions, you have to be able to see it simultaneously with both eyes. And if you're leaping around in the trees all the time, this is a very, very important feature.
And to make sure you don't fall, you need to be able to hold on.
Their front hands, or paws in this case, are very, very different. The coati has got flat paws with claws on, and he can't really grip as well as the lemur. The lemur here has got hands. She's got 4 fingers and a thumb. She's also got fingernails as opposed to claws, and she can grasp just like we can.
If you want to leap around on broad surfaces like tree trunks, having claws as grappling hooks is a very good idea. They dig in and you can move around. But once the supports you're leaping to are thinner, then the claws are not so effective, and it's much better to be able to grasp them in a pincer action.
Like many mammals whose ancestors survived by hiding from the dinosaurs, most of the early primates appear to have been nocturnal. They probably lived their lives a bit like bush babies today. These are solitary and see in black and white, but their fantastic hand-eye coordination allows them to catch food on the wing and to leap about the treetops at great speed. Here then is where the human story probably started, dangling on the branch in the middle of a dark forest.
I'm convinced that many of these early features of the primates were absolutely fundamental to our own evolution. It provided the basis for what we are today. One very good example is provided by the large forward-facing eyes, which permit 3-dimensional vision in connection with the brain, and the grasping hands, because once you use your grasping hands in front of your eyes, you then get a feedback possibility. You can hold something in your hands, you can manipulate it. What we're talking about here is the fundamental basis for tool making, which was one of the big breakthroughs in human evolution.
The next chapter in our evolutionary story came when primates abandoned the night and stepped out into the sunlight. "45 million years ago, a new type of primate appeared, with a much more familiar face. Unfortunately, fossils from this time are extremely rare, and usually only fragments of bone exist. But an extraordinary technique borrowed from medicine is allowing scientist Dr. Christoph Zollikofer to piece together the bones to help us visualize what these primates were like. Using a scanner, they take 3-dimensional images of the fragments and then manipulate them in the computer.
The basic idea is to put them together like a 3-dimensional puzzle. You can see here the fragments of the lower jaw, and here the fragments of the 2 upper jaws. So with these fragments, parts of them come from the left side of the body, parts from the right side. We can try to reconstruct a more or less complete face of this animal.
Where pieces of the fossil are missing, the computer can generate a mirror image to complete it.
Nein, du kannst einfach Mirror Copy machen.
To get a proper look at this animal, the scientists can go further and use the computer to build a model. Guided by the 3-dimensional image, a laser traces the exact shape of the fossil, layer by layer, onto a light-sensitive resin. The resin reacts and sets hard to reveal a reconstruction of the fossil. This is an extraordinary moment, a chance for paleontologist Dr. Martin to come face to face with the next stage in man's evolution, the monkeys.
Well, here it is, hot off the press, a real monkey face. You know, with the individual bits and pieces of this, it's difficult to get a good impression, but when you put them together, and you look into that from the front, there, the outsides of the eye sockets directed straight forward. You can imagine the rest of the eye sockets here, and that's the face here. And so what we're doing here is looking straight into the face of a 45-million-year-old monkey.
Monkeys took primates in a whole new direction. Living during the daytime brought them a new look compared to earlier primates. They have flatter faces, and their eyesight is superb. Not only can they see in 3 dimensions, but they also see the world in color. Primatologist Dr. Louise Barrett knows just how important this is for survival.
Colour vision is very useful for monkeys because they rely much more on fruit as part of their diet. They don't eat insects and those kinds of things. So if you can identify ripe fruit, that's very handy. And ripe fruit's usually brightly coloured. It's red or yellow, not unlikely to be green. The other reason why colour vision is very useful for monkeys is because for communication. These monkeys have got quite nice white spots on their noses, and the family that they belong to are known for having very elaborate facial patterning, and that's all part of communication. And in a lot of cases, it's communicating between species so that you don't end up mating with the wrong kind of monkey, which would be a bit of a disaster.
Monkeys' flat faces and small noses came from sacrificing their sense of smell, but their good looks made up for it.
Because monkeys aren't so reliant on smell to communicate with other animals, it's allowed them to have a much reduced snout. Their nose is no longer wet, and they don't have a split and divided upper lip in the same way that the lower primates and other mammals do. And what that means is that if you've now got a sort of furry, mobile upper lip and much greater freedom of your facial muscles, you can have greater facial expression. That's very important because facial expression is because these are animals without any language facilities. They can't speak to each other. They rely on their facial expressions to communicate. So, for example, threat displays often involve like moving the brows up and down in this kind of way. And then submission can be equally well conveyed by using what's called a submissive grin. So they bare their teeth and like this. So, I mean, whereas we bare our teeth to smile and it's kind of a friendly gesture, this is kind of a fear gesture. They're baring their teeth. I'm very scared and I won't do any harm to you. Baboons have a very nice facial expression, which is sort of a very sort of friendly expression, and they pull their ears back and they raise their eyebrows and then they sort of smack their lips at whoever they're quite interested in, and they go. And that's been called the come hither expression, which I think is very appropriate.
We can identify with these non-verbal signals because they remain a key part of human communication. We recognize whether someone is happy, sad, angry, or plain embarrassed, just by looking at their faces. This all started back in prehistory with day-living monkeys because they had such hectic social lives.
Becoming day-living presents a different set of challenges because you're much more vulnerable to certain different types of predators that operate in different ways. And so what that's selected for in the monkeys is group living. So most monkeys are live in groups and are intensely social. They spend a lot of their day grooming each other. They're very concerned about who's who and who's doing what with whom and keeping up and catching up with everybody. and they've kind of capitalised on that, and they've become these kind of quite political animals, and they manoeuvre and use their social relationships to get ahead in the game, and use that to enhance their position within a group so that they can get the best food, have the best allies, all those kinds of things.
All this networking had a profound effect on another part of the monkey's body.
Doing all that in your head, it requires a lot of computing power, you know, to keep track of who's what and who's who. It's like a big soap opera, and you need to keep on top of it all the time, otherwise you're going to suffer the consequences. So that pressure to always be on the ball, to always know what's going on within the group, selected for a better and more cognitive function, better brains in short.
The complex politics of group life seemed to drive an increase in brain size. It was the start of what was to become a distinctly human characteristic. Monkeys spread across the world, and it wasn't long before a new branch of brainy primates sprang up. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans are our closest living relatives. They are the apes.
This is Bo. He's an orangutan infant, and he's a member of the great ape family, which is the family that we belong to. So, like us, he's got grasping hands. He has a large brain for his body size, and because of that, they have long pregnancies and a very long period of parental care.
Trees have always been the ancestral home of the primates, but apes began the process of coming down to the ground.
The great apes are much bigger than monkeys. And because of that, they can't run along the tops of branches in the way that monkeys do. They have to climb. They move along the ground, they climb up the trees, and then they kind of semi-swing through the branches in order to get their food. Because of this, they've got a much more upright posture, and they've got a much broader chest than monkeys.
Apes tend to swing or clamber through the branches rather than leap like the monkeys, so they lost the need for a tail.
When they move around on the ground, the great apes have a particular unique posture. They knuckle walk. Like monkeys plant their hands on the ground, or sometimes just their fingertips, whereas the apes use their knuckles, or if the case of the orangutan, they use their whole, they walk on their fists. And so that gives them a kind of much more semi-erect posture, and that's partly because their arms are so much longer than their legs. As they move around, they're just going to be much higher up at the front and the back because their arms are longer than their legs, and that's what they're resting on. Hello. Reminds me of my husband.
Apes may be close relatives, but we know they're not family. There must have been a point in evolution when our ancestors stepped out from among the apes and took a new path.
Hello, Danny.
To help identify the fundamental difference between apes and humans, Danny the chimpanzee is going to take Professor Leslie Aiello for a walk. First, they're covering their feet in mud to make footprints.
Yuck. Yucky. It's fun to play dirty, isn't it? Come on. Come on.
As they walk together, they leave a muddy trail behind them, which Professor Aiello can take a closer look at.
Well done. Let's see what we did here. The main difference in the print is in the chimpanzee print. It's short, it's wide, and you have the opposable thumb, or the big toe sticks out just like a grasping thumb in a hand. Now, if you compare that to a human footprint, our footprints are very long, relatively narrow, and again, very importantly, the big toes in line with the rest of the foot.
No other primate except humans normally walks on two legs. It is the most obvious feature that separates us from the rest of the apes. But was upright walking the key development that changed our ancestors' destiny? In 1972, one of the most exciting pieces of evidence regarding human evolution was discovered in Tanzania. It was not a fossil bone, but a track of footprints preserved in volcanic ash. They are thought to have been made by a remarkable creature that walked across this muddy ground over 3.5 million years ago.
This is a cast of the famous footprint trail from the side of Laetoli in northern Tanzania. And it's important because it's one of our earliest evidences of two-footed walking or bipedal walking in our early ancestors. Now, you can see the importance here if we compare the footprints. And this is one of my prints. And you can see here clearly that the big toe is in line with the other toes. And also I have a clear arch on the medial side of my foot. Now, what we can do is compare this with the chimpanzee footprint. And here you can see it's very different because the chimp has a space between the big toe and the lateral toes. Also, there's no evidence at all of knuckle prints. So whoever was making these prints was clearly walking on 2 feet. When we find evidence of upright walking, we have conclusive evidence that we have something that's on the human line rather than on the ape line. From what we know about the fossil record for human evolution, upright walking came first. It preceded the expansion of the brain, it preceded tool use. So when we find something like this, we can be virtually 100% sure that we're dealing with something that's a human ancestor and not an ape ancestor.
These footprints are tantalizing evidence of a remarkable creature. An ape that finally gave up its ancestral home in the trees and came to the ground.
This is so exciting because it's actual evidence of behavior. We don't have to infer from bones what the function was. We can just see it here. This is exactly like walking on a beach or seeing your footprints on the wet bathroom floor. We can tell what was happening. It's a snapshot in time. And you can just imagine them walking across this ash-covered plain, very much like we would walk today.
The identity of this creature was finally confirmed when they found a skeleton from that time, which seemed part ape and part human, called Australopithecus.
This is one of the best Australopithecine skulls we have. And if you actually saw this, it would have looked very chimpanzee-like. The brain's fairly small, just marginally larger than a chimpanzee. The Australopithecines had a fairly projecting face, but the nose was quite flat. It would have been a very ape-like or chimpanzee-like nose. One of the giveaways, though, that it wasn't a chimpanzee is that the foramen magnum, the hole through which the spinal cord enters the brain, is positioned underneath the skull. So the skull would have balanced on the spinal column. And this is a characteristic of a biped. So this individual, even though it superficially looked chimpanzee-like, would have walked on 2 legs and would have been on the human line.
The skeleton and footprints provided evidence for the Walking with Beasts animators to build Australopithecus. But with no creature alive today, it took a lot of advice from scientists before the animators could get one moving.
One of the things that I just don't think is going to work about this one is just simply the fact that it's so bent over and its legs are never straightening up. That if you imagine, well, yeah, exactly. If you try and walk like that,
Yeah, it's never going to do that in any.
no, so you'll get 2 foot down the road. I mean, if you imagine it, if you to stand up and actually stand like that for any period of time, it's such sort of hard work to get anywhere basically from doing this. It's by the time we get down here I can already start to feel it in my thighs, you know, it's just, I don't believe that's going to walk at all.
I think that's correct.
That's a good posture.
It's strangely natural, I think, isn't it?
Makes you look attractive.
The first one I started was this walk here. My initial impression was to go with a very chimp-like walk, because it just felt like, let's try that first, should we say. And then moved on to basically just bringing in more vertical, more upright. These are all fairly rough animations, just trying to get the idea for it. This is almost believable in that it's more upright and it's got the basic timings of a bipedal walk on it. But again, you're looking at there's an awful lot of movement going into getting these legs forward, which is again very, very inefficient. This was when we were, this stage was when I was trying the alternatives, shoulder and hip timings that the scientists had advised us on. Again, it's almost there, but it feels uncomfortable. There's a lot of effort going into each footstep. It looks like it's almost pulling its feet out of mud there, really. It seems like it's got sticky feet, for example. And then from that one to what is the finalised one, which, although not doesn't look terribly chimpanzee or ape-like, and again also doesn't look perfectly human. So it's somewhere in between the two. But at the same time, it doesn't look like it's putting a great deal of effort into getting anywhere, which is the whole idea of a walk. I've learnt more doing this one cycle than I think of any other piece of animation I've done. You can actually see this thing almost developing, evolving on screen, which was quite interesting. And when you get to that point where it looks almost human, but then you suddenly think, no, actually, it's not quite human, is it? That's when we know it was just about right, because basically that's what Australopithecus seems to be. He's not quite ape, he's not quite human.
In one way, walking upright made Australopithecus physically closer to humans than to apes. But does that mean they started to behave the same way? With their hands free to use tools, had they changed into a creature which had started to take control over the animals around them?
Nice one.
South African scientist Dr. Bob Brain has made a meticulous study of the remains of the southern species of Australopithecus. At a cave called Swartkrans, he has found evidence to establish whether walking upright changed these ape men from harmless fruit eaters into casual killers.
This cave of Swartkrans is remarkably rich in fossil bones. Something like 240,000 fossils came out of this excavation alone.
Most were of animals that lived in the bush, but there was also a high proportion of ape-man skulls, minus their bodies. To many, this was evidence of man's darker side.
One possible explanation is that they had been cannibals and they had been professional decapitators, bringing back the skulls of their victims to the place where they lived, and that's how they ended up as fossils. But I wanted to look at the complete picture and see just what other explanations, what other options there might have been.
Dr. Brain had a hunch that the real explanation might be found by studying today's fauna in the bush.
Fortunately, many of the animals that one finds in the wild, in the bush today, are the same, basically, as they were 1 million, 2 million years ago. Some of them have disappeared. The saber-toothed cats have gone, but the leopard is still there, the lion is still there. Well, it seemed to me to be essential to go out into the bush and look at the places where kills had been made.
With an eye for clues, Dr. Brain found a classic kill site.
This is a spot where a leopard had its kill, and unless you come really quickly,
before the remains fall to the ground, you don't find very much because it's immediately scattered by the hyenas and jackals that come to any such place. What you do typically find is the skull. Because this is a resistant part, the teeth and the lower jaw are not very palatable, and these are bits, and particularly the horns, these are the bits that remain.
The sad truth of what was really going on became apparent in one of the fossils.
One of the really interesting pieces of evidence that came from the Swartkrans fossils was in the form of this piece of skull. It comes from the back of the skull of a child, maybe 10 or 11 years old, and it has 2 holes punctured into the parietal bones. Oddly enough, the spacing between these 2 holes is matched almost exactly by the typical spacing of the lower canines of a leopard. So a possible reconstruction that we suggested was that this child was killed by a leopard and dragged away to the feeding place in the lower part of the Swartkrans cave, and this, like so many of the other fossils at Swartkrans, constitutes nothing more than the remains of cat's dinners.
So walking upright helped us to get a move on, but we were still cat food.
For an ape man living in the relatively open savanna, I think life must have been fairly scary. Not only were they fairly small creatures, but they had very little in the way of natural defenses. They didn't have large teeth, fangs or claws. And there was a great variety of dangerous predators always waiting around them. Apart from the carnivores that we are so familiar with today, like the lion and the leopard and several hyenas, there was a whole range of other carnivores, such as the saber-toothed cats, always skulking around waiting for an easy meal.
But predators weren't the only thing to make life tough for the Australopithecus. Two and a half million years ago, the weather took a turn for the worse. It got colder and drier. It was the start of the Ice Age, and the changing climate had a profound effect on our ancestors.
Well, it seems that as conditions became more and more difficult for survival, 2 different strategies were attempted. The one was used by the robust ape men, and they had a very characteristic skull, usually with a flat face, a wide flat face, and this strategy seems to have been one of toughening yourself up, in that way trying to overcome the really difficult conditions. Altogether, a tough-looking, robust individual. That was the one alternative. The other, which occurred in our own human and pre-human lineage, was simply an enlargement in the size of the brain. And this is reflected from the beginning of the human lineage. And in the case of these creatures, they seem to live by their wits rather than by their strength. And of the 2 options, this proved to be the one that came through.
The robust ape men became extinct, whilst the descendants of the larger brain species moved out of Africa and began to extend their range across the world. For those that went as far as northern Europe, for the first time they had to cope with permafrost and freezing winters. The landscape was dominated by cold weather specialists. Megaloceros, a giant deer, woolly rhinos, and herds of magnificent mammoths. The only primate that could survive in these conditions was a highly specialized, cold-adapted human. It was a Neanderthal. walking with beasts, the Neanderthals were so close to modern humans that actors, rather than animation, were used to recreate them. But it still required 3 hours in makeup to be transformed.
Neanderthal features, and particularly the features of their face, were an important part of their total adaptation. What you would see is a jaw that sticks forward, that juts forward, very large eyebrow ridges, a low forehead. The very large fleshy nose on Neanderthals is very interesting because it's in fact an adaptation to cold climate. The big nose, in fact, warmed and humidified air as it was going into their lungs and helped them maintain very high activity rates in extremely cold weather. In fact, I suspect their noses were running a good portion of the time, and the Neanderthals probably weren't very pretty to look at when they were engaging in physical activity. They may have been pretty ugly people, actually.
Nice, excellent. I beg your pardon.
Nice.
The Neanderthals may have looked unsavory, but they certainly weren't stupid. In fact, their brains were somewhat larger than modern humans, and the fossil record seems to suggest they certainly weren't cat food anymore. Evidence that their relationship with animals had changed has been found on the island of Jersey in the English Channel. Archaeologist Dr. Paul Callow has been studying the remains found at the base of this cliff to piece together what went on here. Hundreds of bones have been found here, and they tell a remarkable story.
Now, what's so special about this place is that during the excavations, huge numbers of mammoth and woolly rhino bones were found. There were some other species as well, but those were the most important ones. We have an example here of one of the teeth that was found of a mammoth. Now, it wasn't so much the sheer quantity of them that's important. Instead, it was the way they were organized within the site.
During the excavations in 1969, archaeologists were astonished to find animal bones like these stacked neatly together, rather than all jumbled up.
It's extremely unusual to find bones like this, and it really does indicate human intervention of some kind. And in fact, we can find the culprit, because there's plenty of evidence. This is the kind of tool that Neanderthal man was making. And if we look at some of the bones, we can find the sort of scratch marks that were made when stone tools were used to cut the flesh off the bone.
It was not only scratch marks found on the bones. When the teeth of Neanderthals were discovered at the site, it seemed certain that Neanderthals had been involved in some kind of organized slaughter. But the mystery was, how did they get so many of these giant animals into this location? Dr. Callow believes the cliff provides a clue.
Now imagine, instead of today's coastal scene, a vast grassy plain extending for many kilometers out there. And, on the plateau, a herd of mammoth, perhaps a few woolly rhino grazing. Now, if Neanderthal man could get behind them and drive them this way towards the headland on which I'm sitting, once he'd cut off their retreat and got them moving this way, there was really nowhere for them to go except downwards into the ravine here. Now, of course, we don't really know how Neanderthals would have persuaded mammoths to move in this way. We don't really know, of course, what would spook a mammoth even, for sure. However, we do know one technology that Neanderthals had, which would certainly have been very useful, and that is fire. In the ravine itself, there are masses of charcoal and burnt bone. Now, with fire, you light it behind the mammoths when the wind's in the right direction, they really don't have any option but to come in this direction.
Here was a primate that had swapped fruit eating for meat eating. And it just so happens that these professional killers were around when the giant mammals started to disappear. Having survived some of the hardest conditions on Earth, magnificent creatures like the woolly rhinos, the woolly mammoths, and Megaloceros all became extinct as the last ice age ended. Although the Neanderthals might look guilty, there are other suspects in the case. Cousins of the Neanderthals reached Europe just at the time the great mammals started to go extinct. Instead of being cold adapted, their bodies were taller and leaner than the Neanderthals. Their skulls were higher and more rounded, with bony chins and a lack of brow ridges. They were called Cro-Magnon. They were modern humans.
That's like where we were running from.
On the surface, the Cro-Magnons looked ill-equipped to survive the harsh conditions. They had no physical adaptations to the cold.
Ice Age environments were extremely tough. With our very thin tropical bodies, humans could not survive up here. If I were a naked human, I would be dead within an hour. Instead, we developed complex cultures and complex technologies in order to survive. Modern technologies use synthetic fibers. In the Ice Age, what they had was animals. They were able to kill animals, use the meat for food, use the hides for clothing, use the bones and antlers to make tools. And with those simple things put together in a very sophisticated way, people were able to live in these very difficult environments.
The DV, you've got the DV there.
Cro-Magnons were inventors. They had a far greater range of tools than the Neanderthals and used a variety of different materials. They survived because they were adaptable.
Wow. Neanderthal tools were made of chipped stone. They made simple tools for chopping and cutting wood. Tools like this could be used for scraping hides and processing animal materials. And of course, spear points were used for hunting. Modern humans, on the other hand, also made simple stone tools, but they were more efficient. But importantly, they mounted them on handles, so that it allowed them to be used with great mechanical advantage in scraping a hide, for example. A handle gives you a lot of advantage. And in addition, they made tools out of other materials, such as antler and bone. What you would be using if you were living 30,000 years ago in Europe is spears tipped with antler points like this. But if you feel the points on these, they are razor sharp, and you could penetrate, you could easily penetrate very, very deeply. Initially, they were on spears that you threw by hand, but at about 20,000 years ago, people started using the spear thrower, or atlatl, and how that worked is you had a socket at the end of a very large feathered spear.
So like a...
Yeah, and just hold it more or less parallel to the ground. It'll flex up. It'll actually go up initially.
Okay. Oh.
All right. Way to go. Okay.
Way to go, man. Whoa. Isn't that pretty awesome?
They represented a really revolutionary increase in firepower, so to speak, because here you could kill animals at a very significant distance and safely. One of the problems Neanderthals had was they had throwing spears, but often the spears weren't sharp. They didn't have those real sharp tips. So you just wounded an animal, and then you had to move in close. There's lots of injury on Neanderthal bones. People actually did a study a while back trying to find modern people who had same patterns of injuries, and it turns out it was rodeo cowboys who get stomped on by animals. And that's the same pattern of upper body injuries that the Neanderthals had.
The Neanderthals lived a much more dangerous life than the Cro-Magnons, and they were also a lot less adaptable. In fact, all the evidence shows that they were just as much victims as the large mammals. This points the finger of suspicion for the mass extinction firmly at Cro-Magnons. Was it their superior hunting skills that sparked this catastrophe?
Humans certainly hunted the large mammals of the Ice Age. They did hunt mammoth, they did hunt woolly rhino, they certainly hunted Megaloceros, the giant elk, but they didn't do so that frequently. The most common animals that they hunted were wild cattle, reindeer, horse, and red deer. So it's unlikely that humans had much impact on the extinction of those large mammals.
There is a tendency for us humans to think that we have always been a global force. But it seems back then we simply did not have the technology or the numbers to wreak such havoc amongst the giant mammals. Many scientists now believe something else must have been going on. The latest research shows that ice ages can end not in thousands of years, but in a matter of decades, with catastrophic results.
The rapid fluctuations of climate, where in particular you could have warming episodes of 6 to 7 degrees Celsius in the space of less than 30 years, probably caused so much vegetational disruption that these large mammals, particularly the large species, were not able to adapt. And because they had low population densities and slow reproductive rates, those environmental changes are the most likely cause for their extinction rather than overhunting by humans.
The Earth is a far greater force than we are, and it was probably a massive and catastrophic change in climate that drove the giant mammals to extinction. Despite our sense of power over the Earth and its animals today, we are vulnerable. If we were to face the sudden onset of another ice age, it is entirely possible our whole complex and fragile society could fall apart. But don't worry, it probably won't happen in our lifetime.
Always look on the bright side of life. Always look on the light side of life. Hey. Always look on the bright side of life. Come on. Always look on the bright side of life. Always look on the bright side of life. Worst things happen to see, you know. Always look on the bright side. I mean, what you got to lose? You know, you come from nothing, you're going back to nothing. What you lost? Nothing. Look on the right side of life. Nothing will come from nothing.